Thank you very much. In 2024, just last year, Elon Musk announced his first successful implantation of a wireless brain chip in a human patient through his company Neuralink. The project aims to fulfill Neuralink's mission to, quote, restore autonomy to those with unmet medical needs, unquote, by enabling paralyzed users to communicate with others through mentally controlled devices. The project could also contribute to the second half of Neuralink's mission, which is to unlock human potential tomorrow by enhancing cognitive functions and expanding mental capabilities. I was actually just at one of Neuralink's centers in Austin, Texas a few weeks ago, and I was told that I was the first priest to go inside. Perhaps I can offer myself as a chaplain. Because of the non-disclosure agreement, I'm not at liberty to tell you whether or not I've received a chip. So Musk innovation is the latest in a long line of both exciting and somewhat frightening technological developments that just demonstrate how emerging technologies offer both therapeutic healing and human enhancement possibilities. Like Peter Thiel, Mark Zuckerberg, Mark Andreessen, and other big tech billionaires, Musk aligns himself with certain ideals of the so-called transhumanist project, while not formally affiliated with any specific transhumanist organization. So he is not a card-carrying transhumanist, but perhaps some of his projects go toward that direction and align with what a lot of other self-professed transhumanists seek in terms of improving the human species or even going beyond the human species. Musk has asserted publicly that major progress in machine-human interface is essential for humans to keep pace with superintelligent AI systems, lest humans become as obsolete as apes. My conference here is going to look at this claim that humans have a duty to transcend the limits of human nature, those limits imposed by biological evolution up until this point. Now, both the Thomist tradition and the transhumanist movement seek some form of human perfection through a notion of ongoing improvement. However, differing notions of human nature and the telos of human nature significantly distinguish such efforts. I want to clarify a bit the meaning of the natural moral law tradition and show how to differentiate it from misunderstandings that could easily arise when we reduce nature to, say, a mere biological set of non-rational processes. I want to also look at how a correct understanding of human nature and the goods that fulfill such a nature could facilitate constructive debate about the types of biomedical enhancement to accept as beneficial for human flourishing and which to reject as harmful to authentic growth. I contend that without an objective standard of human nature to evaluate enhancement proposals, biotechnological modifications cannot even reliably be classified either as improvements or impairments. Unfortunately, both bioconservative critics of human enhancement and transhumanist advocates for radical biotechnological change present somewhat limited visions of human nature's potential for transformation and for perfection. And I think that Thomism possesses the kind of resources needed to overcome too static a notion of human nature and can address some of these philosophical imprecisions. And time permitting, I'd also like to briefly note how I think Thomism can provide a kind of anthropological vision that's needed to frame a productive conversation about how virtues guide this human nature toward perfection. But we'll see what we can do in this limited amount of time. So, a little bit of background here on this transition from biological evolution to technological evolution in this kind of period of humanity plus or humanity 2.0. Transhumanism, for those who are not so familiar with the term or the movement, is usually referred to as the intellectual and cultural movement that uses technology to radically enhance human beings at a cognitive level, physically, emotionally, and perhaps even morally. The evolutionary biologist Julian Huxley used the term famously in 1957 to describe this new phase of human-driven evolution in which we would finally be able to achieve this higher life form through a commitment to different forms of technological progress. Later, and more recently, there was a landmark document called simply the Transhumanist Frequently Asked Questions, which is a helpful document. It's kind of like the Transhumanist Catechism, for those not familiar. You get the key questions and very concise, though insightful responses. And there, it says that transhumanism is based on the premise that the human species in its current form does not represent the end of our development, but rather a comparatively early phase. The Oxford philosophy professor Nick Bostrom, who was a lead author of this text in its various versions, describes the human product of evolution, us, as a half-baked work in progress, desperately in need of technological improvement. Also, the bioethicist Alan Buchanan, who's addressed a lot of these enhancement issues, observes that what he calls fickle evolution is indifferent to human welfare, and that when it does happen to achieve what's good for us, the means it uses are typically ghastly. So Buchanan, Bostrom, and others see no guiding intelligence behind humanity's evolutionary history, only blind, indifferent forces. One of the earliest popularizers of transhumanist philosophy, Max More, expresses this profound dissatisfaction with the evolved human condition in a charming work called A Letter to Mother Nature, Amendments to the Human Constitution. So if you're looking for some fun reading this evening or tomorrow, I recommend this work. Now, he's willing to acknowledge that there are a lot of wonderful qualities that we've acquired over this long, gradual evolutionary process. But unfortunately, we still find ourselves rather susceptible to injury, illness, aging, and death. He also laments that evolved humans are functional only under narrow environmental conditions, and that we must continually struggle with limited memory, poor impulse control, and tribalistic, xenophobic urges. He then goes on to propose 7 amendments to the human condition that aim to correct and exceed the limits of natural selection, which of course is where technological advances and radical enhancement would come in to fix this somewhat botched condition we find ourselves in. Now, one of the most popular and influential transhumanist figures today is the historian Yuval Noah Harari. And he talks often about how humans are on the verge of this next step of the evolutionary process. But we're not going to be merely the random byproduct of these natural blind forces. Rather, this next step is going to be one that we drive and direct ourselves. He summarizes the vision as followed. For 4 billion years, life was governed by the laws of natural selection. During all these eons, whether you were a virus or a dinosaur, you evolved according to the principles of natural selection. No matter what strange and bizarre shapes life took, it remained confined to the organic realm. Whether a cactus or a whale, you were made of organic compounds and you remained subject to the laws of organic chemistry. In the next 2 centuries, however, science could be ushering in the era of inorganic life shaped by intelligent design. So he's become a believer. Not quite. Not the intelligent design of some god above the clouds, but our intelligent design, and the intelligent design of our cloud computing. So, this is the vision that technology, and now in particular, advanced forms of artificial intelligence, are finally going to bring us past the limits of evolution and natural selection to this new stage, a kind of enhanced transhuman stage, and perhaps even a kind of post-human stage. There's a lot of talk in the literature, even of those who, again, do not present themselves necessarily as transhumanists, that the time has come to hack Darwinism. This is a common phrase, to hack Darwinism. To use prosthetics, pharmacological substances, brain-computer interfaces, and other technologies to basically make us smarter, stronger, happier, and with longer lives. And you can understand the attraction in this, right? I don't think that it's only with a financial interest in mind. It's not only to make money, but there's a genuine concern about improving our well-being on this planet, or perhaps in other planets, because, of course, one of the major projects of many trans or posthumanists is space colonization, with the idea that the resources here will not suffice, and so we'll need to go off to other planets, or that other planets could potentially provide for us an even more enriching form of life than we could ever dream of here on Earth. And you can see where some of the enhancement proposals come in, because we do not seem to be very well equipped for life on Mars or other planets. But if we could tweak, if we could hack ourselves, we might just be able to make it. Now, looking at the limits of biological evolution, you also get some figures who are aligned with these projects, figures who promote ideas of enhancement, like Julian Savulescu, who for a long time was at Oxford until he moved over to Singapore, I believe, and he advocates for a more intentional use of technology already widely spread, namely assisted reproductive technology. And he thinks that this shift away from biological reproduction, with all of its risk, all of the possibly debilitating mutations and other problems that can occur, should give way to a much more controlled and rational, well-planned form of in vitro fertilization and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, so that we can actively choose for those embryos that seem to have the best chance of the best life possible. Now, this process appears to favor greatly the autonomy of users, but it seems to lean quite heavily toward the autonomy of adult users, not so much to the well-being of those embryos who are eventually subjected to the decision of whether or not they should go on or not. And a certain utilitarian morality seems prevalent among some of these thinkers who are willing to sacrifice those considered unfit for the sake of those considered to have a better, a more promising future. So I mentioned earlier that both Thomism and transhumanism has this shared concern with perfection. And we see occasionally in transhumanist text this great concern. Stefan Sorgner, who's a German transhumanist who actually works at, not too far from here in Rome, in Trastevere, at John Cabot, has written that the transhumanist discourse necessarily requires reflection on the meaning of perfection. Similarly, there are others who have seen that this pursuit for better people often leads to this kind of unceasing quest for the perfect, or as close to perfect as possible. Now, those working in a Thomistic tradition, or those working in a broader Catholic tradition, of course, are very familiar with this notion of perfection, the pursuit of perfection. It's something we look for in the spiritual life. Some of us even profess to live a state of perfection. Not that we've arrived, but that we have chosen certain commitments, made certain sacrifices, because it's a life that's more conducive to reaching that goal of fulfillment, of flourishing, of what we would call holiness. But from the Catholic perspective, this perfection exceeds our natural capacities. So while metaphysics may be able to very helpfully instruct us, the light of faith shows us the fuller picture. Now, someone who's done a lot of work in this area is James Keenan, the Catholic bioethicist, and he looks at how these different notions of nature undergird these kinds of conversations and debates about perfection and its meaning. And he points out the fact that there's a serious risk of assigning disproportionate value to what is statistically normal when we have an impoverished notion of nature. And there can even be this unnecessary fear of medical advances when ethicists lack a teleological understanding of human nature. So he says that since we do not say who we ought to become, we believe that we should not go beyond the undefined natural that we identify as normal. So what Keenan wants us to do is come to a richer understanding of nature, which he thinks is part of the Thomistic tradition, and not reduce it to the simply normal or the statistically probable. So without this solid understanding, it's easy to think of nature as just what tends to happen, instead of the essence of a being insofar as it's ordered to specific actions. Stephen Pope is another thinker who's talked about this need to carefully distinguish the natural as normative from the natural as statistically common. That which constitutes normality is constantly fluctuating. So such a notion of the biologically normal remains an unreliable guide for ethics. But if we return to this notion of the natural as the normative, as what entails the rational ordering of certain biological tendencies through free human choices ordered to authentic human goods, then we can avoid some of these pitfalls. So they're calling for a clear understanding of human telos to guide these biological and bioethical debates and deliberations. Assumptions about human nature and human flourishing underline the complete embrace of radical enhancement that we see in some transhumanist figures, and also the outright rejection that we find in so-called bioconservatives. So you can look at many figures. One prominent bioconservative, Francis Fukuyama, speculated that the more we advanced in biological and biotechnical interventions, the greater the risk would become that we would actually change human nature. And if we changed human nature, that would be disastrous for the whole liberal democratic process, because we would no longer have clear who was part of the moral community, and we would no longer have a clear sense of fundamental shared human rights. So there's a fear among some that these biotechnical enhancements might actually change human nature. And then there's the excitement among the so-called trans or posthumanists, that these changes will really get us beyond human nature. We find very much in the transhumanist literature a prizing of autonomy, a radical autonomy that's understood as a kind of unbridled exercise of individual will. And we'll find in the bioconservative literature more an emphasis on humans having a givenness and having a certain vulnerability, a weakness, a limitation that they need to work within and grow within. I think that the Thomistic tradition can harmonize these different insights. We recognize our limits, we recognize the givenness of our human nature, but we also emphasize quite clearly the centrality of free choice, of autonomy, in shaping the type of people we are. We heard earlier that there is a certain sense in which we can speak of a kind of self-creation, self-definition, but we wouldn't understand this as a radical self-invention, but rather as something that works within the inbuilt teleology and order of our given nature. So we would avoid a static enshrinement of biological normalcy that we find in some of the bioconservative thought, but we would also have some questions about the prudence or even the feasibility of some proposals for more radical enhancement that claim to radically transform us or even provide a new species. I think that enhancement technologies that assist humans in obtaining the goods that realize natural capacities would be, on the face of it, praiseworthy. Jason Eberl, a Catholic bioethicist who's done a lot of work in this area, speaks in these terms of looking at two fundamental criteria for assessing some of these enhancements. So first, any enhancement needs to promote or protect a fundamental human good inherent to human nature in a way that neither intentionally harms nor diminishes other goods, nor deceives people by offering only a superficial realization of one of their capacities. Second, the enhancement should empower the agent to realize the human good without replacing his dignity as an agent, as someone with volition and choice. Now, many enthusiastic enhancement advocates have dismissed calls for caution as merely fearful, irrational religious superstition. But I think that these philosophers begin to provide us with tools to see that there's a fundamental neglect of human animality in a lot of these proposals, and a disregard for the goodness of being an animal, even though, ironically enough, there's a great concern for material well-being, biological well-being in the initial stages of the enhancement proposals. There's this dynamic where there's a push for the smarter, the faster, the more intelligent, but that seems to only go so far. After that initial improvement, that kind of transhumanist phase, there's the contention that we need to move to the posthumanist phase, because the body, for all of the goods and joys that it seems to provide, also remains a source of limit. It remains something that keeps us trapped in the finite. And so the suspicion of human animality comes in here. And the hope is that once we improve our condition enough, we'll be able to actually cast aside the full limits of the body and enjoy a new form, a more disembodied experience. Now, unfortunately, many contemporary transhumanists draw on a kind of atheistic philosophy that gets incorporated into their vision of evolution. And we know full well that there are various models of human evolution that are not necessarily atheistic. But we could hear in the frequently asked questions and in other texts the kind of assumption that this evolutionary process is unguided, blind, and indifferent to us, and that it is an alternative explanation to any sort of theistic or religious explanation. We see this more explicitly in figures like Bostrom, who we spoke of earlier. He dismisses organized religion as an ineffective route to salvation, arguing that it should give way to something superior, something more promising, like transhumanism. He thinks that past religions, like Catholicism or many others, have offered these unsubstantiated claims of future benefits, of a better world in the life to come. In contrast, he argues that his school seeks to make the dreams come true in this world by relying not on supernatural powers or divine intervention, but on rational thinking and empiricism. He sees this movement as the most promising and rational path to combat the sickness, suffering, aging, and death that, in his opinion, past religions have tried to address but have failed to solve. These are problems that religions have failed to solve. And again, we appreciate the inbuilt thrust within transhumanism toward a posthumanism. Because if these are the main enemies, if these are the main obstacles to full flourishing and happiness, sickness, suffering, aging, and death, and if they're so intimately tied with the body, then it would seem that the trans enhancements, the enhancements of the transhumanist phase, are only a kind of temporary stopgate to help prepare us for that further liberation. Now, this introduces a great difficulty for the trans or posthumanists when they want to discuss a more universal moral code. Because again, they've dismissed the possibility or the likelihood of any kind of intelligent origin or guide to this world that's so marred by suffering, sickness, and death. But if there's no transcendent author of a kind of natural law, kind of unified morality, it's difficult to ground any claims to some sort of code that can bind people across different cultures and across different time periods. This rejection of God that's so prominent in many expressions of contemporary trans and posthumanism begins to cast doubt on the normativity or even the existence of a shared human nature. This vision thus renders the notion of a teleological human nature, of a natural moral law, suspect. Deeply felt values become personal preferences without any sort of solid metaphysical foundation that show them to be real goods that are fitting for our common human nature. And this subjectivistic ethic stemming from their vision seemed to deprive trans and posthumans of the conceptual resources to discuss concepts as fundamental as enhancement. They can only mention change if there is no nature or telos towards which that nature should aim. And I think that this theoretical gap in trans and posthuman thought is particularly glaring when recalling aspirations to achieve a moral enhancement, because any effort for moral growth seems to presuppose some notion of what is good or bad for the human person. So my contention here is not simply that Thomists and trans posthumanists are going to differ about certain uses of biotechnology. That can occur, and we can have serious, robust debates about that. I want to point at something that I think is even more fundamental. My contention is that many of them lack the very resources to ground any intelligible conversation about enhancement, in the sense that we usually use the term enhancement to refer to an improvement, to something better. It's a value judgment. I think that they're often left with only the ability to describe change. This particular intervention will change. Whether that's for better or worse seems left up to each individual. So we see this very post-human fluid concept of human identity that tends to undergird trans post-human understandings of human nature and human flourishing. There's a great concern about respect for personal autonomy in choosing different life projects. but there's no real sense that this can become a common project, something shared by the rest of society. They're left in a kind of disenchanted, immanent frame. And I think from this perspective, the tendency to present the human being as fundamentally self-creating, self-defining, makes a lot of sense. You see this, for instance, in Martine Rothblatt, a prominent transhumanist thinker, who's written quite clearly about this as being something characteristic and a distinguishing mark of human beings. Self-definition, self-creation. But again, this is not the kind of qualified self-creation of growing in virtue and perfecting a human nature. This is a more total and radical form of self-invention. And while that might seem very strange to many of us, I think it follows very logically from the background commitments that they've made. Now, as sort of cosmic orphans, they seem to be the best equipped to give any sort of meaning or purpose to life. In a world without a transcendent author, it seems to make a lot of sense to give that responsibility to each human person to decide and define. But I think, unfortunately, that can become the condition for a lot of societal conflict, because we can no longer appeal to a shared nature, a shared moral law, when we're arbitrating these disputes about biotechnology, and will be, in many cases, left with a kind of clash of wills and of power. And we see how many of these thinkers also have great difficulty in even identifying a special value for the human being. For many, humans become the most advanced and capable of the creatures at this particular moment. We've developed the best techniques for exploiting our natural resources and keeping competing species at bay. Yet, it's not entirely clear that we have a kind of inherent worth, and there's no inbuilt moral purpose within our nature. And for many, true persons must exhibit certain characteristics, whether that be rationality, self-consciousness, preference formation, visualization of the self over time, or any other given characteristic. Now, this perspective excludes from the moral community many categories of people: the preborn who lack desirable traits, the elderly whose possession of these key traits has diminished or seemingly disappeared, those who are experiencing severe cognitive impairments, and a host of other people we can think of. Personal dignity becomes something that's attained at a certain point and then can potentially be lost. Now, in the time remaining, I also want to give a more focused critique of some proposals for the posthuman, because many of the transhumanists see radical enhancement as the transition to the posthuman, to this new species. And I think that there are some imprecisions here that could stand to be clarified, and that would really help both camps to navigate the best way to use technology. So we see, for instance, philosopher Mark Walker, who's convinced that the posthuman will constitute a radically new species, separate from the Homo sapiens we know today. And he speculates that we will be able to differentiate posthumans from good old-fashioned humans like us based on radically superior moral and intellectual virtues, which are rooted in an altered biology, similar to how we can currently distinguish humans from chimps due to certain differences in intellectual and moral capacities. But I think here Walker, like others, confuses a difference in degree with a difference in kind. So we can point to the fact that there are a host of unique capacities, whether comes to understanding universals, abstract concepts, judgments, logical deductions, and a host of other expressions of these capacities, manifestations of these capacities that really enrich human culture and distinguishes that culture from other beings. Nick Bostrom thinks that this post-human, for instance, will be as able to create this spectacular new form of music and enjoy these sorts of pleasures. And he says that the post-human will be as superior to Bach as Bach was to the composers of Muzak, like the type of thing you hear when you're waiting in an elevator. But I think, again, we're dealing with a difference in degree, not in kind. Maybe the post-humans will be extremely rational, but I don't think they'll be above rationality in the sense of acquiring something radically new to distinguish them as a new species with a new nature. And our understanding of human nature makes clear that it's subject to a broad array of changes and improvements in which different potentialities are actualized. Enhancements can perfect or improve capacities for better health, cognition, emotional stability that are already latent in our common human nature. Current or future medicine might better dispose matter to the proper operation of human nature's powers. And this improved disposition of matter would better our performance of certain tasks. It could mitigate the effects of disease or even of aging, and it could greatly prolong our earthly existence. But this longer, more productive human life does not constitute a new, non- or post-human species. So speciation can take place through generation, by which the material substrate loses one substantial form and then gains another substantial form that actualizes a potency within the generic nature of the parents. The proximate genus of the parents is open to various determinations, contained potentially in the parents and actualized in the offspring. Even though the offspring is of a different species than the parent, its species actualizes a potency within its ancestor's essence. Were this longed-for post-human to arise from humanity, it would be necessary to actualize in it some specific difference beyond rationality contained potentially in human nature. But the enhancements normally associated with the trans-post-human projects perfect human animality through sensitive and cognitive improvement. While these developments may significantly modify or enrich human lives, the changes do not add a specific difference that would distinguish the post-human as a new species. We might want to call this enhanced being a superhuman, but I wouldn't want to use the term post-human. And very much to my surprise, Thomas Aquinas has speculated about this sort of thing. I'm not making this up. He imagines the situation of adding rationality to an ox. And he's convinced that if that were to somehow occur, you would actually have a human being. That human being would maintain the typical morphological and physiological features of a four-legged herbivore, but you would have a rational animal. Again, a rational animal that would look and in many ways act differently than the humans that we see around us today. But he makes that point to emphasize this clear distinction of what is or is not a human and forms part of human nature. So more recently, there have been philosophers like David Oderberg who have speculated in these lines. So he gives the example of the glog. The glog is a three-headed, 12-tentacled creature with 17 sense organs and a clay spherical body. The glog would communicate through its own language. And perhaps it would even have an unfamiliar medium for its communication, like microwave pulses. It would also construct a plan of life with a hierarchy of goals and approach the world with wonder and seek to resolve deep questions of meaning. It might even come to a Thomistic Institute event. But the glog's manner of life, as different as it may appear, as impossible as it would be for us, practically speaking, to enter into a conversation with the glog, as strange as the glog's looks and behavior seems to us, it would still be a rational animal. It would still be a species like our own. And so even this glog seems not to constitute a kind of advanced post-human. We would have all sorts of interesting questions about how to interact or relate to the glog, perhaps all sorts of questions about when and how to baptize the glog, or how to incorporate the glog into a life of worship. But it seems like it would be a distinct variety under the species of rational animal, and not some sort of completely, utterly different being. So Oderberg does this sort of thought experiment, not just to have fun with his imagination, but to help point out the fact that this glog is even more different than some of the proposals for the kind of post-human that transhumanist thinkers imagine us achieving through brain-computer interface, advanced AI systems, pharmacological interventions, and so forth. So these enhanced beings are not even necessarily as different as the imagined glog. We can expect that they would still be humans. Humans, perhaps, we could say, with a fuller experience of their animality. Maybe they're faster and stronger than we are. Or a more potent exercise of rationality, if we actually manage to improve our cognition in serious ways or achieve the kind of mental telepathy that Neuralink is talking about quite seriously these days. So I think we would still be dealing with fellow human beings. There would, of course, be questions of societal tension about how to relate well with these beings, about how to interact with them in society, but it would seem like they would share a same set of human rights, and that it would be misguided to think that their perhaps greater intelligence, decision-making ability, physical prowess, or any other characteristic would make them deserving of dominance of the planet. They would still be fundamentally rational animal humans that we would have to figure out how to interact with. So this kind of speculation is meant to help us clarify some of the imprecisions that can arise in common debates about therapy and enhancement. Now, I've done work elsewhere defending the notion that it's possible to prudentially incorporate certain forms of enhancement, even beyond what we would normally consider therapy, into a vision of the good life. Basically, that it is not intrinsically wrong to move beyond the biological norm of health, or what's statistically most common in health. But I think any of those interventions, no matter what they do to improve our cognitive life or stabilize our moods, are only tools that need to be chosen and utilized prudentially. They're not guarantees of a moral superiority. I think the highest, richest form of enhancement, we could say, is a life of virtue. Certainly for the believer, also a life of grace, of fidelity to the Lord and his plan, which is something that's accessible to all people, even those who have, we could say, been dealt a very difficult situation or have not won the genetic lottery. Even those who suffer certain setbacks or limitations in their physical life or in other capacities still have access to the possibility of growing in virtue and making and receiving the gifts of grace. So while these kinds of technological enhancements might remove certain obstacles from us in the pursuit of virtue, or might nudge us, incline us to the practice of certain virtues, I don't think any of them will ever guarantee the good life. That's something rooted in free choices and freely habituated virtue. So this virtue ethics model that's central to a Thomistic view, I think, provides guidance to help the moral agent achieve a harmonious fulfillment of all his intellectual, emotional, and volitional dimensions as an individual and as a member of a society. These virtues enable all of us to consistently pursue those goods toward which the natural moral law's precepts direct us. Fears or dreams of a biotechnologically driven posthuman state could potentially distract from the more fruitful task of achieving perfection through virtue formation. Biotechnology may produce modified human beings, but the altered beings will not constitute a new posthuman species. Even if humans gain a new facility in physical and cognitive task, they will retain the rationality that makes them distinct from other members of the animal kingdom and provides that sure foundation for ethical and human rights discourse. Humans are privileged to shape and improve their character in ways that biomedicine can aid but not replace. Hence, these virtue ethics offers the authentic human perfection that trans and posthumanists rightly desire, but unfortunately often fail to attain due to a reductive perspective on human nature. Thank you for your attention.